Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Wellman's Podcast. I'm really excited about today because I have a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Sunita, on, who's going to basically talk about vaccinations, the pros and the cons, and try to clear up some of the misconceptions, possible conspiracy theories out there. So I'm really excited about this. She is my go-to person for vaccine expertise, but just a little bit about her. She's a graduate from the University of Chicago, and then also got her medical degree at Bastyr University. She is the expert in what pediatrics, midwifery, and then also just general medicine, and owns a big practice in Seattle called the Eastside Natural Medicine Practice, and it's kind of becoming the biggest, the feeder practice for students I have here from Bastyr. And she also teaches at the University of Washington, and is a senior lecturer there. You can find her just about anywhere online. I would definitely have you guys check out her blog, drsunita.blog. You can find her on Instagram, Dr. Sunita. We'll put all this on at the end of when we post this podcast. But Sunita, am I missing anything? Should we go over anything else?
No, you got it.
All right.
And if I have my hands in too many pots, it's my own fault. So,
well, so I guess the first thing is I'd imagine you give a lot of vaccinations and educate people on vaccinations quite a bit based on background.
Yeah, I do. In our practice, well, this is according to our folks at the Department of Health in Washington State. We're apparently the largest vaccine program in Washington, as far as naturopathic clinics go. But a lot of the other pediatric clinics in the area are pretty much our same size. So just for perspective from the conventional model, we give almost as many vaccines as they do. So that's definitely a perspective that I'm speaking from.
And do you typically follow the government mandated schedule for vaccinations? When you give
yes and no. We have a lot of people who are doing the regular vaccine schedule.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that our audience in our clinic is probably natural light. That's kind of how I like to describe them. That they're looking for a conversation. They really want to understand what the vaccines are about. They want to understand the schedule. They don't want to just be told what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to understand where the information comes from to support that. But they're ultimately up for immunizing. Mm-hmm. And then we get a lot of people, I would say, that's probably like a good 30 to 40% of our patient population. And then probably a lot in the middle are doing alternative schedules, either that they craft on their own or that they've found in other places. But we sit down and talk about it together. So they bring it in and we literally map out the whole thing. What is this going to look like from birth all the way through 2 years of age? And there are a lot of reasons for why people want to do alternative schedules in terms of beliefs, philosophy, timing, and maybe even just concerns they have for their own kiddos.
Right.
And then we have, a good amount of people who are also just really strongly against immunizing their kids, possibly permanently, or at least at this time. And we have conversations with them too.
Okay. So somebody comes in and just says, I'm absolutely against vaccinations. There's a lot of education that has to go into that. As far as that goes, is that, do you consider that putting their child at risk by not immunizing at all?
Well, yes and no. Okay. I mean, there are a lot of ways to look at this issue.
All right.
Yes, but I will say, that I have to own my perspective, right? Which is that I give a lot of vaccines. Right. I do trust them as a tool.
Okay.
I mean, at this point, I've given tens of thousands of immunizations, so I do trust them as a tool.
Okay.
I took an oath to engage in preventive medicine. Right. They are an incredibly efficient, not just technologically, but also cost-wise, efficient preventive medicine. Mm-hmm. So that feels, in alignment with my thinking as well in terms of my training. But in terms of the risk piece, it's really challenging to evaluate that, because you have to think about, what do you mean by risk? Are you talking about the whole population? Are you talking about the globe? Or are you talking about one family? And I feel like that's the conversation that I'm having all the time, is personal risk versus public, community, global risk.
Okay.
And when I will say that, I'm making an assumption based on conversations I've had, that when families come in and ask, is this putting my kid at risk? Or do you think it's putting my kid at risk? I have to ask, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that, is your child directly at risk of contracting polio? Well, for real, not so much, right? I mean, living in the Pacific Northwest at this time, 2019, there are not any recognized wild cases of polio. So is your child at risk for contracting polio today? No. But are you talking about in the span of that child's lifetime? Are you talking about if you travel to another continent? Are you talking about, as a contributor to herd immunity, internationally? Yeah, that kiddo is at risk if you put them in any of those other scenarios.
I see.
So that's the thing, is to really figure out what people mean by being at risk.
You just said a term called herd immunity. What does that mean exactly? Because I hear that a lot in the vaccine debate.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, oh, I should probably, say what I mean when I say those things. So thank you. Herd immunity is really the term that we use to describe whether or not our entire surrounding community, really our herd around us, is immune or not to a disease. And when we say immune, I think this is a thing to really to emphasize to a lot of people when you're talking with them about vaccines, is it doesn't mean 100%. There's literally nothing that's 100%. So it means most of the population is immune, and you're usually talking about 98 to 99%, so pretty darn good stats.
Right.
But that even when we have achieved quote unquote herd immunity, it doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the herd is immune. Just like if, put it in the context of people who actually deal with herds of animals,
right?
There's always going to be that small percentage that get the thing you're protecting them from or die.
Okay. But so so is it possible for somebody to get a vaccination to something and still get the disease, right? Is that what you're, okay.
Yeah. So that's the other thing too. And, when you talk about risk, is giving the kid, is not doing the vaccine risky? Sure. In certain contexts, absolutely. But is also giving the vaccine risky? Sure, absolutely. And it would be incorrect for me to say that there aren't kids who experience vaccine reactions that are severe. It would be untrue for me to say that people haven't died from vaccines.
Right. Okay. But so you can still get the vaccine. I would imagine your risk of getting whatever disease or illness is lower, but you still can get it.
Absolutely.
But if most people get vaccinated within a community, it's unlikely to spread.
Yeah, that's the other piece of the herd immunity, is that, even though it's not 100%, the likelihood that that disease can survive in that community and thrive and continue on is really, really slim, almost to none. So that's kind of what people look at, that threshold of herd immunity. And when we have larger groups of people who aren't vaccinating, we start to see the herd immunity drop, which means that the disease can then thrive in our community.
Yeah, that was my next question. So, so if people are not getting vaccinated, the disease can spread or thrive. Is that the reason why, I've recently read articles about, is it measles, big measles outbreaks, and is that primarily the reason it's happening? Because within that community, a lot of people, or more than normal, are not getting vaccinated, so it's likely to spread, even though that could be spread from somebody who got vaccinated and still got the disease.
Absolutely. I mean, so at least all these, the context of Washington State, most of the people who have contracted measles in Washington, and we have hundreds and hundreds of cases in this state right now. I mean, well beyond what we've ever seen over the last 15, 20 years since we've considered it, quote unquote, eradicated.
Yeah.
Meaning it's not zero, but it's as close to zero as we can get.
Right.
So it's, when we're tracking, you know, who's getting measles, you know, is it vaccinated people? Is it unvaccinated people? It's mostly people who have not received any vaccines, or people who haven't completed the series, because there's actually two. Okay. So I think that's also the other piece that people are, that people find controversial, is that they've had one, but not the second, but they still got the illness.
I see.
Yeah, so it's mostly people who have either no vaccinations or incomplete vaccinations. And really what we're seeing is in communities where people are either under or unimmunized, that's where measles in particular is thriving. Right. And then we're seeing that in other little communities around the country too, where there are pretty low vaccination rates. So it seems like where immunization rates drop below 90%, is in certain communities or all, you know, states altogether, is where we're starting to see a lot of these illnesses come back. People are also tracking whether or not, well, maybe measles mutated, like maybe it changed itself and now is outwitting the vaccine, and that's why we're seeing it. And that's not that, so far that hasn't looked true.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the other big thing that I hear out there is, well, you're putting all these chemicals in the vaccine. I mean, why are you doing that? And it's like blown up like a conspiracy theory, like the government is trying to hurt us. Can you just, you know, trying to harm us in some way? Can you just speak about that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, there are chemicals in the vaccines. Right. So, I mean, I'll definitely say I see a lot of people who are really concerned about that, you know, the toxic aspect of vaccines. And it's true, there are things in there. There are things that sound like heavy metals, like aluminum, mercury. It comes in the form of something called thimerosal. So that's what people often see if they're looking online. It's just a form of mercury. There's formaldehyde, you know, so people associate that with like cadavers and things like that. But they are in very, very tiny particles, so even smaller than what we would typically find in a meal. So if we eat out, or we eat things that are actually not organically grown, if we eat highly processed food, if we eat rice, because unfortunately rice, one of my favorite things to eat, is able to extract a lot of metals from the soil. Right. A lot of these same things are going to be contained in that. So, just a quick little thing, you know, mercury was used in vaccines mostly as like a stabilizer. Think of it as like a preservative. Okay. But most of the vaccines that we give anymore, specifically I'll say Washington State, and I think this is true for a lot of vaccine programs, there isn't any mercury contained in them. Okay. So that's just something to be able to tell people, like, actually, you know, it was there, but it's not there. Aluminum is there, but it actually has to be there in order for the vaccine to be effective. So you're talking about micromoles of aluminum, but because they're not live vaccines, like I'm not literally giving you a particle of measles to get your body immune to measles, aluminum has to be in there to kind of agitate your system and say, hey, you know, pay attention to me, you do something about me, you know, so that if I give you a vaccine, it's actually useful. So if I took the aluminum out, which is, you know, again, far smaller than would be even in a lot of the things that kids put in their body in a day. Right. In terms of quantity, the vaccine would be useless, and there would be no point in giving it to anyone because all the rest of the medicine wouldn't get where it needed to go.
And this is what you call adjuvants, right?
Exactly.
So it enhances the effectiveness of the vaccine. That's why they're in there.
Yep.
Because you certainly wouldn't give a live measles thing because you're likely to cause them to get measles then, right?
More likely. I mean, even when we gave a lot of live vaccines, you still see fairly low transmission, meaning like people aren't necessarily passing that along to other people, even when they have live vaccines. But that's definitely the way that we have changed vaccines over the last 40 years, is that we have a lot of vaccines that don't have to be live, and aluminum is a big piece of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about, and they're putting other things in there, like I hear like egg proteins, things like that. Is
Mhm.
that all in there just to make it more effective? Or to,
It's
or to
kind of
put,
how they grow the base for the vaccine. So in order for, say, the flu vaccine to be useful, or for instance, the measles vaccine, chickenpox vaccine to be useful, that's actually how they grow it, is with what they call chicken albumin. So basically egg whites. Yeah.
okay. Okay. So you're getting, all right. So you're getting some of that in there. Well,
Hmm.
I mean, that's great. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff that we consider bad, has a negative connotation to it, like aluminum,
Hmm.
actually makes the vaccine more effective. That's why they're in there. So there's
Yeah.
no government, madman saying, oh, let's hurt people by injecting them full of aluminum. No.
Well,
No, I don't think so. I think if we had to fear our government, I don't think aluminum's the way they're going to do it. But I totally also respect that, the government doesn't have a super great reputation, and a
Right.
lot of vaccine and public health messaging is coming from them,
Right. So
and it's
there's
really,
mistrust there. Yeah.
yeah. So I absolutely appreciate that as well.
So who comes up with these vaccine schedules? Is it state specific, or does the United States decide as a whole?
It's mostly national.
Okay.
And I mean, and has been for a while. So I think at some point states have the ability to require different things in their schools. But the baseline schedule is given by the CDC.
Okay. And then, so where can someone go and find out what is in their vaccine? Like you mentioned, like in Washington, there's no longer mercury in that vaccine.
Right.
Where can someone get that information?
That's a good question. There's something called the Pink Books on the CDC website, and they're free to everybody. And it has it's a giant encyclopedia for anyone who's interested in reading it. And it has all the adjuvants and excipients in there. So basically all the ingredients of every single vaccine, and broken down by brand name. So all the brands that are distributed in the United States, all of those are contained in that Pink Book with all of their ingredients.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Sunita, what about the schedule? So, I hear that the schedule keeps getting larger and larger and larger. And again, that's kind of for the anti-vaxxers, it's kind of like an argument too. Why is it getting so big? Why do kids today get, I don't know, hundreds of vaccines, whereas when I was young, it was a lot less? Can you speak to that?
Well, a couple things. I mean, one piece is technology, right? As things evolve and more things show up in our community, or we figure out that there's a way to address it. We're trying to figure out how we can do this. I will say, from a healthcare perspective, how we can do this as efficiently as possible and really cost efficiently. And vaccines are a pretty cost efficient method when you think about it that way. So there are more vaccines on the schedule for sure than when I was a kid. Well, not me specifically, because I immigrated as a child. And so I've had literally every vaccine known to humankind. So slightly different scenario. But at the time, had I been born in the United States, we would have had MMR, DTP, and polio, and that's it.
Okay.
The difference is kind of what I was saying before about the live vaccine versus not having live vaccines. And that definitely changed some of the efficacy of some of the vaccines, where we actually had to give more doses of the same vaccine to get the same immunity from it than giving the live vaccine. But the live vaccine had problems. So for instance, think about like DTP, which you would have gotten, I would have gotten. That was still being pretty widely used all through the 70s and even into the early 80s. You saw definitely a lot more reactions to that vaccine, not just high fevers, but also seizures, things like that. So it was more effective because it was live pertussis or whooping cough, but you definitely saw more issues with it. Right. So technology evolved and figure out, okay, how can we keep kids honestly out of the hospital from giving them a preventive medicine and then they have to be hospitalized for it? That seems kind of ridiculous, right? That you're trying to do something better for them and then you create a worse situation. So it really was founded ultimately in some real observations, also addressing cost and healthcare stuff, but also like the personal burden of families. But what resulted is that sometimes you end up with more vaccines on the schedule. So now we do DTaP, which has the diphtheria, tetanus, and acellular pertussis. So it's basically like a not live version. But we have to do 5 doses instead of like 3 doses.
Okay.
That kind of stuff.
All right. So that's one of the reasons why you're getting more injections, more vaccinations, right? Because if you count all the doses that you're doing. Okay.
And then there's other things like, Hib or pneumococcal, which show up on the baby schedule, like on the, infant schedule. Those are things that when we looked at the whole system, we're like, wow, we're spending, tens of millions of dollars on hospitalization due to infant pneumonia. What is what is one thing that we could do? We could offer everybody, so everybody has access to it, not just people who have money or people who don't have money, but everyone gets to have access to it. What's one thing we can do that would reduce the cost of kids who are hospitalized due to pneumonia, but also the burden on families too, right? I mean, that's a cost.
Yeah.
Literal cost, dollars, but also the cost of having a kid hospitalized with pneumonia is, well, it's terrifying. So.
Right. Especially to a parent having to go through that. What about lifelong immunity and just partial immunity? I mean, as opposed, because I hear like, when you're using these synthetic forms of immunity with vaccinations, you don't, it's not as effective as actually getting the real thing. Is there truth to that or not?
Yes and no.
Okay.
For the most part, a lot of the things that we vaccinate for are life-threatening. So the risk of becoming immune from those things comes with the risk of dying from that thing.
I see.
So that's, always weighing out the concerns from a healthcare perspective, like the CDC doctors are thinking about like, well, I'd really like you to not die from invasive Hib to get that immunity. So it would be great to be able to offer you this vaccine so that you don't have to have that. But even partial immunity can decrease the severity of an illness. So we see that with pertussis in particular, and even the flu vaccine, which has a lot of controversy around it, because it doesn't look super effective. But what we're talking about is also decreasing the severity of the disease so that each person doesn't have to be sick for weeks, maybe decreases the course of the illness to like 5 days instead of 15 days. That's a really big deal for families.
Yeah. So would that even if you don't, so you go get the flu vaccine and there's a strain of flu going around that's not necessarily the same thing as what you're getting vaccinated for. Does it still give you some immunity? Possibly? Some
immunity. Yeah. Because it's, the programming, so to speak, that our immune system does is to kind of adapt to those viruses that are in the flu vaccine, and they do their best. There's actually some really cool research and really cool thinkers in people who track the flu illness around the world. Actually really fascinating from a research perspective. They do their best. They try to come up with what they can, but the way that it interacts with the immune system is the immune system is at least able to be somewhat adaptable to another strain of flu that year, even if it's not the exact same ones in the exact same form that were contained in the vaccine. And again, what they're looking at is, did it not necessarily like, did you not get the flu, but maybe you just got the flu for 3 days, or maybe you didn't have to go to the hospital with the flu.
So here's the question I have, and I have my opinion about it, but it's fair to say we don't know all the science on this, right? Like we don't know really if there's like really bad negative consequences of these vaccines later on in life, right? Like 40 years from now. So you hear the argument, well, you're given these vaccines, they mimic certain molecules in your body that can promote growth hormones or, turn off tumor suppressor genes, cause cancer later on, cause autoimmune disease. Can you speak to that for a minute? I'll tell you my piece on what I think about that too, but.
That's a really challenging question. I feel like when people bring that question to me, and I have that conversation a lot, I really just have to start with, I don't know.
Yeah.
And be fully cognizant of the fact that I really don't know.
Right.
And our research is limited by our model of thinking and our model of medicine also.
Right. Right.
Which doesn't make it bad. It just means that it's limited. We are, what is it? We only use 30% of our brain capacity or something like that. We're
Right.
just limited thinkers as humans.
Right.
So we don't know. When I don't know something, I try to go back to biochemistry, physiology, like how does the body work? And it could make sense to me on both sides that I give your body a suggestion, I give your immune system a suggestion, and it acts appropriately.
Yeah.
And then you have a really appropriate, normal immune response in that you're immune to that thing that I've given to you. Say it's polio.
Okay.
And then there's other people whose immune systems are going to go rogue and go do other things. And so if I give you the polio vaccine, then you have the possibility that then it affects, tumor suppressor markers or causes, autoimmune, like kind of that, what we call the Th1, Th2 shift in the immune system, where it kind of goes from like seek and destroy to sort of, in a tizzy.
Right.
So it's possible that the vaccines could do that too. But honestly, the same thing is true about the illness if you were to get it. And so if you were to actually have polio, the same thing is possibly true.
Right.
That you could have a totally immune response and clear it, which 99% of the time that was true, even when polio was alive and well. Or you could have a really aberrant or rogue response to that actual illness. And
right.
So really the truth is, to me, when I think about it that way, I don't know on either side of the coin what could be true. That same person who's having an autoimmune response to the vaccines, 30 years later, I don't know that they wouldn't have had an autoimmune response to the illness itself, right? Like
Right.
maybe their immune system was switched on or off in a certain way or altered in a certain way that was always going to happen. But luckily they didn't have to find out at 4. They got to find out at 44,
Right. No, and I agree with that. And here's the other point I'd add to that is, science, when we're talking about science, science evolves. I mean, that's the whole thing about science. We never know enough information, and we have to use the information that we know now, right? Instead of speculating about what might be. We can't really say, we have no proof of these vaccines causing cancer. At least right now, we don't.
Right.
But as we get more information, we may. What we do have proof over is vaccines save lives, right? I mean, they do save lives. We have a lot of information on that. So I always feel like, the what ifs, what could be, let's go with what we have now. And, we're doing one big experiment in every aspects of our lives, culturally, socially, medically, at least with the time that we live in. Future generations are going to benefit from what we're doing now because they're going to know more. Yep. Right?
Absolutely. And those questions that people are asking are good questions. I mean, that's how research happens. That's how science evolves, is we have to ask the questions, but we also have to own that we don't know.
Right. Yeah. We don't know either way, but we do have an idea, just like you said. You mentioned we do know that even if you got the disease, the same thing can happen. Even if you didn't get the disease, you still can come down with an autoimmune condition that we don't know how you got, whether you got vaccinated or not.
Well, and when many of these illnesses were alive and well, you didn't get to find out whether or not you were going to get autoimmune disease. You were dead.
Right.
So there's that too. I think that we are living longer as a population, and all the way around the world, and people aren't dying from these things in the way that they used to. And so we are also seeing more of these things. So if we're kind of trying to put pieces together or make correlations and say that, vaccines are related to autoimmune disease, you could just as easily say, well, yeah, they kind of are, because now you're living long enough to have the autoimmune disease.
Or one of the biggest risk factors for cancer is old age, right? Living well into old age, right?
Exactly. You live long enough, chances are you're going to have cancer.
Yeah.
It's almost Yeah, sometimes it's easy to line those things up next to each other and say, oh yeah, they're definitely causing each other. And that's a conversation I have with parents a lot, and really try to clarify these technical terms, correlation and causation.
Right.
When things are sitting side by side and something happens, it's easy to say, oh, that caused that. When really, nope, they were literally just sitting in the same room together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any genetic testing, or how much of a component is kind of this newfound interest in genetics in the health community allowing us to make more informed choices about these vaccines?
That's a good question. Honestly, there hasn't been a lot of well-researched or well-documented, I'll say, correlation between genetic testing and vaccines. There are definitely more and more people trying, because 23andMe and a lot of other genetic tests are out there, people are getting them done and bringing them in and then wanting to look at all of their genome and figure out, well, can you tell me if based on this, I'm much more likely to have a reaction or not? And really, in the end, what we know from genetics itself and from geneticists is they would never say that your genetic code determines whether or not this thing will happen, right? I mean, epigenetics is where it's at, meaning that the genes have to be turned on and off. And there's lots of other things that trigger that turning on and off, mostly the onslaught of our daily life, right? Stress, the sleep, the water, the lack of water, and the type of food we eat. That's more likely to turn on or off our genes and possibly affect our ability, like whether or not we would have a poor reaction to a vaccine or not.
Okay.
So it kind of brings it back almost a little bit more to lifestyle for me in those conversations than it does to the genetics piece.
Right.
But that's a great question. I think that's another one of those, we don't know. And I wish we knew more.
Yeah.
Can you say the same thing that we don't know, or do we know? I mean, what's the correlation between autism and vaccines? I mean, where do we stand with that whole thing?
Well, this is a tough one because, so Andrew Wakefield, his paper, that correlated the two, autism and specifically the MMR vaccine, was redacted. So meaning it was basically found to be not valid. And he lost his medical license. And it looked like he falsified his information.
Right.
And when people have tried to reproduce his studies, so this is a big piece of validation in research and science, is people try to do what you did again and again. Because if it's really a human phenomenon and not just a one-off, we should be able to make this happen again.
Right.
Literally, it's like reproduction, like we should be able to make more humans and, if this thing works, right?
Right.
But people weren't able to reproduce his results, and lots of people tried. So that was the other piece. And then once people realized, we can't actually figure out how this happened mathematically or in real time, it was found that, he actually fudged his data. That happens in research too.
Right.
But it spurred a lot of that conversation and that connection. So there's a lot of interesting memes and graphs that go on online that correlate autism rates. And you'll see the curve going kind of from top or from bottom all the way up and kind of skyrocketing autism diagnoses and literally mirroring a curve of how many vaccines we get. But then there's also simultaneous memes out there about, availability of organic produce and the amount of vaccines, and the amount of autism we see.
Right.
So if you look at any set of numbers, you would see that, organic produce could be causing autism.
Right.
If you look at it that way, right?
Yes.
And it's a fascinating thing to think about what is actually causing autism. So working with a lot of kids and families and having, a number of kids in my practice who are all along the spectrum and have been diagnosed with autism. My little, this is, purely just my own personal clinical experience. All the kids who have been diagnosed as autistic in my practice actually have not been immunized at all, interestingly enough. And in all of the kids who were fully immunized in my practice, I don't have a single diagnosis of autism amongst those kids. So that's sort of an interesting thing that I have just personally noted. Obviously, this is my own, my own data set, not applicable to the whole human population. But I just think it's fascinating to look at what people are saying is happening out there and what I'm seeing, and it doesn't seem to match for me.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because a lot of people would not even go there. They'd say, oh, well, to get autism, you need the vaccinations. You're saying, well, you actually see kids with autism that never got vaccinated.
Yeah. It's the other piece is we're also more aware of it too. So not to say that like when you have a hammer, everything's a nail, but when you are aware of what autism looks like, that there's actually a formal diagnosis. I mean, it's not easy to make, but that there's something that you can recognize and diagnose, you're going to make more diagnoses too. I mean, that's just the reality.
Right.
So of course the number of diagnoses increased over the last 15, 20 years because we didn't really even know how to recognize it 20 years ago.
Right. Right. I see. And that's a more logical explanation too, right? I mean,
yeah,
you see it more. Why are we jumping right to the conclusion? Well, it's vaccinations, that type of thing. Like what's more, that's where I always go with arguments like these and possible conspiracy theories. What's more logical?
Right.
I mean, is it more logical that there's this government group that is, let's give people autism with vaccines, or is it more logical that we're just diagnosing it better and see, it's like, I don't know, it just seems pretty reasonable and obvious to me. But on that same token, we still, like we were talking about before, we don't know. We need more information. And that's the beautiful thing about science. It's a self-correcting mechanism that will eventually give us some concrete answers to a lot of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And even though, all professions, research, science, law, whatever it is, politicians, are rife with some ethical issues, bias, all of that. We are humans. We can't rid ourselves of those things. So, people, that is definitely one controversy that is laying at the feet of science and researchers is that, they're owned by corporations or government institutions, that kind of thing. But, being a teacher, in an institution myself, working with other faculty members, really a lot of us who engage in research, use research all the time, we're just sort of thinking, questioning people. And really, oftentimes, it's very interesting to me to see people's stereotypes of who does research and who creates that information. And then to know very personally and work alongside the people who are creating that information. I'm like, oh, they're actually just really nerdy seeking types, with really no agenda beyond answering really hard questions.
Okay, that's good to know. So they're not the evil people behind the scenes doing crazy stuff.
No, it's really fascinating too. I mean, I think to also have that perspective, because I get it. When you're outside and you're looking at that monolith of an academic institution that seems to be partnered with the government. They don't look like they're conspiring for your good. And I totally understand that people really look at that feeling excluded from it.
Yeah.
And therefore not cared for by it. And then the recommendations that come out from there feel suspicious.
Right.
But, when we talk about autism specifically, but really any reactions to vaccines, the thing that also makes sense to me, again, to come back to biochemistry, physiology, is really burden in the body. And if something is going to be the tipping point where a kiddo does actually move along the spectrum and is diagnosed with autism, or experiences another event, what is the most likely thing that would have caused that? It's likely the things they're exposed to all the time or were exposed to for a longer period of time, meaning their immediate environment, the food that they eat, mentally, emotionally, their immediate environment. Not that I ever want to demonize pregnant people, because it's hard enough to carry a person in your body and raise them, but literally the environment that you grow someone in for 9 months, roughly, is those are much larger exposures time-wise and amount-wise than vaccines are. I mean, vaccines like are literally, they're 0.5 milliliters of fluid. So you're talking like a centimeter of fluid. Yes, is it possible that even the smallest amount could be the straw that breaks the camel's back? Absolutely. But what's more likely to cause the diagnosis or the ill health or whatever thing that we're experiencing is the stuff that we've had much more exposure to. So that's kind of where I also go with that discussion with families too, is what's most likely, even when we don't know.
Right. Okay. Well, I had another question I have, because I hear this argument all the time about one particular vaccine, and that's the Hep B vaccine. And why in the world would we vaccinate a young child who's definitely not sexually active, an infant, right? Somebody just born. Why would we vaccinate them with hepatitis B? Why do we do that?
It's a good question. I mean, that is definitely looking at population health and not at personal health. So that's definitely where, when I have the conversation with families, like, okay, for a moment, step out of your little, micro unit of your family and step into the larger world that we live in. Here's the deal, is that if babies contract Hep B, even if it's really rare, they have a nearly 100% chance of liver failure and possible death.
Wow.
Whereas if you or I were to contract Hep B at our age, we have like about a 90 to 95% chance of complete remission, and maybe only a 5 to 10% chance that we would actually have liver failure, and it wouldn't necessarily be complete either.
Okay.
So we're also much more able to withstand it.
Okay.
On the flip side, we have, potentially way more behaviors that put us at risk than babies do.
Right.
So that's mostly why it is. It's not that like all babies are at risk of contracting, a bloodborne pathogen like Hep B.
Right.
They're not having sex, they're not using IV drugs, but sometimes we don't know what their health status is going to be. And these are hard questions to have with families, but the things that we have to bring up is, you don't know that your child might not end up at the hospital and need a blood transfusion. Those are things that we don't know. And if that happens, we have great testing practices, all of that, but that is one of the ways that people contract hepatitis B. You don't know that when you go into a doctor's office that clinic doesn't have Hep B positive clients. And if there's any of that person's blood in that clinic, it can actually live outside the body for days.
Oh, wow.
Not just a couple, like HIV dies pretty much, almost instantly on contact with air once it's outside the body. Hep B can live on a surface like a table or a countertop for days, which, we all use Cavicide and all this stuff to clean out all the things, like that's part of our jobs as healthcare owners or healthcare clinic owners. But, you don't know what your kids' exposures are going to be in those types of settings. And that is still a way that they can contract it. A couple of cases that were, very rare, but what that has happened nationally is bites with kids. Again, you don't know other people's statuses. And then that's a more common way that kids transmit blood to each other is through biting, so they're like on a playground or very often in daycares. And that's how they do it. So those are just kind of putting it in the context of, the outside your family experience. Like, yes, your sweet little baby is not having sex or using IV drugs, but the world around us has lots of other things going on, and we do live in the world, and here are all the possible ways that you could come into contact with. And then a harder conversation to have with people is, we don't always get to know whether or not people touch our children without their consent or in ways that are appropriate.
Right.
And that is also the way that children have contracted Hep B. And I've worked with a couple of those kids over my years, where they've actually contracted a number of diseases that way. Wow. So that sounds, none of those things are things that parents want to think about, obviously. But, it's my job as a healthcare provider to help them think about that. Like, we're not thinking about life or death always with vaccines, but we're thinking about all the like gray stuff in between.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point.
Well,
I think go ahead, Brian.
Makes a good point as to why that one would be so early as well in the schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. That, we're not thinking about teenagers who are making choices about their bodies, or, well after marriage, depending on what people's viewpoints are. We're thinking about kids who don't have control over their exposures.
Right.
Damn. Okay. What about the chickenpox vaccine? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
you always hear these things where, you know, I got the chickenpox naturally. I don't really remember it. My mom said I just sailed through it, whereas my younger brother got it. And I remember him at, how old was he? I don't know. I think he was probably 3 or something. And I was 5 or 6. I remember him screaming for like 2 days on end, like, and driving my parents bonkers. But just tell me about it, because some people think it's really a benign, you know, like, oh, just, you know, get it naturally, get it young. It's not a big deal. Go, you know, these chicken pox parties, you know, people go to take their kids. Yeah. But is it life-threatening? Can that be life-threatening? It certainly seemed like it with my brother. I mean, he was miserable.
Is this Jade?
Yeah, this is Jade. Yeah, he got it, man. I remember him. We were on vacation in D.C. My parents brought us up to D.C. to go to the Natural History Museum, and he got it there, and it was, oh my God, he was like so sick.
Well, shoot, talk about a place where you would need your kid vaccinated at the Natural History Museum.
Just having been to DC, like, gosh, that place is so pestilent. Nasty.
Just thinking of the rails.
Wash your hands again and again. So nasty in here. Yeah, chickenpox is life-threatening potentially in older kids.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, in that younger age group, and honestly, even as young as like 1 or 2 years old, it's miserable for them, right? Because they don't even know it's to their body. And that's, you know, probably being 3 years old didn't help with that situation, because, you know, they're already kind of like teenagers anyway. And then you add chickenpox to that whole milieu, and you're like, oh, this is awful. Yeah, I mean, is it life-threatening? Not necessarily. It is one of the few things that is on the schedule where people are like, why do we vaccinate for that? Like, that's not even really a big deal. There are a lot of other concerns that come up with chickenpox that, you know, I at least broach with families, and then, you know, they decide what they decide. Personally, my own experience was absolute misery, and I would never wish that on anyone. So.
Yeah, well, it was for my brother.
But that's not where I start my conversation with families. You know, it's like, let me tell you how it was for me. Yeah. You know, it would be a super inappropriate way to have them make their decision. So if someone had offered me that vaccine when I was 7 years old, I would have taken it. It was awful.
Right.
However, I did not go to the hospital, and I did not die.
Right.
But I remember at that time, and this is in the statistics, that there were people who were older than me, like in high school age, and they were really, really sick and did have to be hospitalized. And so that's, you know, what they look at is the kids who are 12 to 18. So something about being a little older, teenager, puberty, does seem to make the whole disease process a lot worse. So there's definitely something beneficial about getting it younger.
Okay.
And having lifelong immunity. But there's a couple other considerations. One is like coming back to basics with biochemistry, physiology. Chickenpox is a virus. If you get chickenpox, then you're getting the virus, and then it lives in your body. And then we know that viruses stay with us for pretty much forever. You know, we have like hundreds of thousands of viruses living in us right now. And they're just part of that community in our body. But if you never have to harbor the virus, then you don't necessarily have to have that virus reactivate into something like shingles later.
Right.
So one of the things they're looking at from a population standpoint, because shingles is really painful, requires a lot of medical management, and is one of the things that they're seeing a lot, not only with cancer patients, but elder folks, and, you know, just in all of those groups of people, that they're having to manage quite a bit, and is a really intense process. So what if people could not ever have to harbor that virus in the first place when they were young? Then they don't have to get shingles when they're older, because it's quite miserable. So that's one of the thinking, one of the pieces. And
it is miserable. I've had a number of elderly patients who've gotten shingles, and it's they can't, on those sores. I mean, they don't even want air blowing on it. It's so painful. They can't sit on it. They can't put any gauze on it, and it's awful.
And they're also a risk. So even people who are in remission after cancer treatment, because of the way that their immune system has shifted through the process of not just cancer, but also cancer treatment, they're at risk for shingles for possibly even the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And so it's not uncommon to see that recur over and over again. So that's the other thing, is like, if we could prevent this, so you're thinking like timeline wise in public health,
right? If
we could prevent this thing happening at 5, that could save you possibly decades of suffering later. That's one of the pieces of thinking in that.
Right.
But who's thinking when their kid's about to, about a kid getting chickenpox, about their kid being an elderly person? Most of us don't think about our kids as being adults, period, let alone thinking about them being older people beyond our lifespan.
Right. Right.
The other piece of chickenpox, I put this in my like social justice equity bucket, is not everybody can take 21 days off from work. Getting chickenpox is great, I suppose, if you are if you have the flexibility and the privilege of being home full time with your children, and you can keep them quarantined in your home so that you're not spreading it around the community intentionally,
right,
or unintentionally. But that's ultimately a privilege. Most households, at least in the area that I live in, are two income households. And the incubation period, meaning the time that chickenpox can kind of sit silently in your body before it shows up as the itchy bumps that turn into scabs, is 21 days or 3 weeks. So
wow.
From the time someone's exposed, like, so say you take your kid to a pox party, they're exposed. That kid might not actually get chickenpox for 3 more weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to keep that kid away from other people who don't want chickenpox, right? For 3 weeks.
Right.
Who can do that? I mean, I can't do that. And I own my own business and teach on an academic schedule. I have, we have a lot of flexibility, and yet I cannot take off 3 full weeks to stay home with a quarantined human.
Right. Well, and then you're also talking about what are the, the healthcare costs and the financial, what you're speaking to it there, like the financial costs, both within the family, but also the healthcare costs on the whole system. If when you become older, or get chickenpox older and you have to be hospitalized, where it could have been easily, you could have reduced your risk significantly with the vaccine.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, it's always an interesting question to think about sometimes in hindsight. I would be curious to even talk to people who are older and experiencing shingles but who had chickenpox and say, ask, what do you, if there was a way to have prevented this, this experience, and this is the way it could have happened, what would you have thought about that?
Right.
I always think it's an interesting question because sometimes we don't know how we think about it until the things happened, and then you're like, oh God, that was awful.
Right.
There was something I could have done to not have that. Oh,
yeah.
Why didn't anyone tell me?
Yeah, exactly.
And
go ahead.
You're saying something about the healthcare burden, and this is, again, I pull from my social justice equity bucket a lot on this one. We don't have universal healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And in Washington State, we are lucky. People have insurance. We expanded Medicaid to 433% of the poverty level, so that everybody in the state is insured one way or another.
Wow.
That is not true about a lot of states around this country. So there are still a number of uninsured people. With the removal of the tax penalty, many more people will drop the requirement for insurance at this point because paying for insurance was ultimately financially beneficial rather than taking the tax penalty, right? So that means if people are uninsured, we have more people who are likely to be uninsured, or we have people who have insurance that they're required to buy, and it's a $5,000 deductible,
right,
and a $12,000 individual deductible, and like $100,000 family deductible or something like that. That is a burden. It's not even just the burden on the healthcare system. A lot of people don't give a crap about the healthcare system, right? They're like, whatever, that's the system, it's the government. We hate the government anyway. Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or we think all healthcare should go away. But ultimately, that's a financial burden on that family. To take a kid to the hospital for something, even if they're not hospitalized, you're talking about paying like a couple grand just to walk in the door. Right. And if that kid is hospitalized, you're talking about 50 to 100 grand easy. That bankrupts families. I mean, that was why, for whatever it's worth, people can hate Obamacare, Affordable Care Act all they want. It's definitely imperfect. It's the first round. But that was the reason why it was instituted, is people were literally filing bankruptcy because of medical bills more than anything else, not even the housing crisis.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's the other piece is, we talk about, well, this isn't going to affect my kid, or, I don't have to think about this. And it's like, well, it does affect you if you have $100,000 of medical bills, you know. And it does affect you if your neighbor has $100,000 in medical bills that they can't pay for because they don't have insurance, because you know who's going to pay for that is everybody else.
Right. Yep, exactly. So it's like, you know, thinking globally instead of just thinking about yourself, of how these things impact you or could potentially impact you. Yeah, it's fascinating discussion. I could talk to you about this all day. We definitely want to have you back on, and in fact, we are having you back on. We're talking about some very interesting topics in a couple weeks here, I think, or 3 or 4 weeks. Anything else that we should talk about? Brian, you have any other questions?
No, I was taking copious notes. I thought it was great.
Well, I mean, is there anything else that you feel like you wanted me to touch upon that I didn't? I mean, these always kind of.
Gosh, I mean, you answered all my questions. Definitely. Okay. I mean, a lot of things that I didn't know. So it's fascinating, and definitely makes me, as a physician, much more comfortable about talking about vaccines with people. I don't do a lot of pediatrics and stuff, you know, but this is really helpful. I think it's really helpful for doctors and the lay people out there if they listen to this podcast. So thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
And we look forward to having you back on.
All right, cool. Yes. Look forward to it.
So what we'll do is we'll make sure that we post everything and how people can get in contact with you and all that. It will be on the post and all that. All right.
Cool.